Now let's go straight into today's seminar, which is by Colin Humphreys. He's talking, as you see, about science and the dating of the Easter week events. So this is the very last Tuesday of term, closest to Easter. It's only about 2 weeks, so that's very appropriate to have a talk from him on that topic. And Colin's not a stranger to this. He's actually wrote a paper in the mid-80s on the date of the crucifixion, and I think he's going to bring us up to date on that. But in the intervening period, he's written papers on the date of the nativity, of the birth. Very interesting book on miracles from a scientist's point of view, and that's on sale, I noticed, at the back, although I did also notice there's only 2, so you'll have to be fast if you want to get a signed copy from Colin. So we're very much looking forward to his more recent work on this issue, drawing on contemporary historical and also astronomic data, I think, on the dating of the crucifixion around, or the events around that first Easter. Let me just tell you something about Colin. He's actually Professor of Material Science here in Cambridge, also Professor of Experimental Physics at the Royal Institution, and that comes about because of his interest in public understanding of science. He was, at one point, chairman of the British Association panel of physics, so he certainly had a long interest in that engagement between science and bringing it to the rest of us so we can understand it. I'm not going to read out all the honours and awards he's won, or you'll never hear him speak. But as I say, he's also been very active in the field of science and religion, and it's a great privilege to have him speak to us today. So without further ado, let me hand over to Colin.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Bob said, I'm going to build upon the work on dating the crucifixion. So this is a new talk I haven't given before. The last week of Jesus, arguably the most momentous week in the history of the world. And I'm sure many in this room would say it is the most momentous week in the history of the world. It's so important that many people give it a special name, Passion Week or Holy Week. If you look at the Gospels, it was clearly of enormous importance to the Gospel writers. So Matthew's Gospel devotes 367 verses to describing what Jesus did and said in a in his last week. So that's 25% of his Gospel. Of course, the original Greek was not divided into verses, but this gives some indication of the large amount of writing we have on this. Mark's Gospel, 30% of Mark's Gospel devoted to the last week. Luke, 20%. John's Gospel, a massive 40%. Almost half of his Gospel is devoted to what Jesus did and said in his last week. Despite all this information that we have, there are many problems with understanding what happened in the last week of Jesus, and let me just outline 4 of these problems. The first one, which is certainly well known to the biblical scholars, is the description of the Last Supper. Matthew, Mark and Luke, because they're broadly similar Gospels known as the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke says the Passover meal very clearly was, the Last Supper very clearly was a Passover meal. John's Gospel equally clearly says the Last Supper was before the Passover meal, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. Because of this, Matthew, Mark and Luke give a different date for the crucifixion from John's Gospel. So that's been a major problem which has been known about for centuries, no real agreed solution. And it's a particular problem because Passover meal for Jewish people was such an important meal. It was much more important for them than a Christmas Day meal is, Christmas dinner is for Christians. It was a really special meal. And it's almost inconceivable that Jewish people would mistake whether a meal was a Passover meal or not. So that's really why this puzzle is so hard to understand. This isn't a big problem at all. It's just a puzzle. I throw it out as something which is curious. When biblical scholars try to reconstruct what happened in each of the days of the last week of Jesus, they find on the Wednesday before the Friday crucifixion, so just 2 days before, nothing appears to have happened. And that's just curious. This is the New International Version Study Bible, which says, day of rest, Wednesday, not mentioned in the Gospels. The counting of the days seems to indicate that the Gospels record nothing. And of course that's possible, but we know that the disciples of Jesus were with him for each day of the last week. And even if Jesus spent all day Wednesday in prayer, you would have thought they would have recorded it. So it's a curiosity, which one wouldn't expect. Now, this is back to problems. If you look at the events the Gospels record as happening between the Last Supper and the crucifixion, it's really hard to fit them all in. This asterisk is assigned to me to say, I've got some notes here so I can give you a few more details. Let me read out to you the list of events the Gospels have between the Last Supper and the crucifixion. And if I can find it, you'll see it's quite a long list. So, after the Last Supper, Jesus and the disciples went out to the Mount of Olives. They went to the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane is Aramaic for oil press. There was an oil press there. Jesus prayed, the disciples fell asleep. Jesus prayed again, the disciples fell asleep again. Jesus prayed a third time, the disciples fell asleep a third time. You notice there's no impression of anything being rushed. Jesus was arrested. He was then taken to Annas. Peter then denied him. He was interrogated by Annas and then taken to Caiaphas. There was a trial before the Sanhedrin. Peter's second and third denials followed. Cock crows. Jesus was before the Sanhedrin again. Then Jesus was tried before Pilate. Pilate sent him to Herod in a different part of Jerusalem. Herod sent him back to Pilate. Pilate released Barabbas. Jesus was flogged. The soldiers mocked Jesus. Simon carries Jesus' cross. The crucifixion of Jesus. Scholars have gone around Jerusalem with a stopwatch, literally, trying to put all these events in between a Thursday evening Last Supper and a Friday morning crucifixion. And most scholars just think that some of these events were invented. It's just so hard to fit them in. Then the fourth problem is the trials themselves. We know from the Mishnah that the Sanhedrin did not meet at night. It was illegal for them to meet at night. And in capital cases, they had to meet one day and then confirm their decision the next morning. A bit like the electors in Cambridge choosing professors who do exactly the same thing. So you sleep on this very serious decision and then confirm it the next day. Well, clearly, this could not have happened with the Last Supper on a Thursday evening and crucifixion on Friday morning. And the Gospels don't even hint the trials were illegal. They say that false witnesses were brought, but they don't hint these trials were illegal. So commentators say the trials are some sort of kangaroo trials, but you don't get that impression from the Gospels. And then there are many minor problems. This is just one. John starts his introduction of the last week of Jesus by saying 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived in Bethany. So John is trying to specify the precise day Jesus arrived in Bethany. So if you now go to biblical commentaries on John's Gospel, and I've chosen really 4 quite distinguished authors, and say, when did Jesus arrive in Bethany? So these are commentaries on John's Gospel, particularly on John 12:1. Don Carson says he arrived Friday evening. Raymond Brown, C.K. Barrett, Saturday evening. F.F. Bruce on Sunday. So you can see the confusion in the minds of biblical scholars on really trying to understand what really happened in the last week of Jesus. I should say, what is interesting is, you read any of these commentaries individually, they don't even say there's a problem. And in fact, they don't show they're working. They don't actually work back from the Passover, as you might expect, back to the date of arrival in Bethany. So it'd be quite nice if they showed their work. And I'm reminded of, in the Radcliffe Science Library in Oxford, in the physics section, there's a bit of graffiti on the bookcases, and someone has written E equals mc squared. And then someone else has written, nice one, Alfred, next time show you're working. Which sometimes biblical commentators do their work. Gazer Burnish, who's a very distinguished Oxford scholar, has written quite recently a book called The Passion, published by Penguin Books, so it's aimed at a more popular market. And he says the 4 Gospels are neither simple or coherent. On the contrary, they are filled with discrepancies. And this is certainly the majority view of biblical scholars because of the examples that I've given. It's really hard to understand these real or apparent contradictions in the Gospels. Now, why I wonder about that statement is because of the order of events between the Last Supper and the crucifixion. To get that order, what you do is you go to the four Gospels and you just put together the sequence of events the four Gospels give, of events between the Last Supper and the crucifixion. And if you look at the Gospels, then some Gospels miss out some events and other Gospels miss out other events. So, for example, only John's Gospel tells us Jesus was taken to Annas before he was taken to Caiaphas. Only Luke's Gospel tells us that Jesus was tried before Herod. But if you take, it's a bit like newspaper reports of the tragic 9/11 incident, where some newspaper writers will talk about the brave firemen who made rescues from the Twin Towers, and other newspaper reporters will omit that. If you want a complete story, you try and fit all the stories together. So with the Gospels, you can fit everything they say together, and what you find is that the sequence of events between the Last Supper and the crucifixion is exact in each of the four Gospels, even though some Gospels miss out particular events, but the sequence is exact, and they slot in together perfectly. And there can only be a few explanations for that. One is the Gospel writers took enormous care to get the sequence right, or another possible explanation is that when the Gospels were finally composed, maybe in the sort of time period AD 50 to 90, something like that, when they were finally composed, they inherited a well-established order of events. And you can imagine that the early Christians would have discussed what happened after the crucifixion, would have discussed these events of the last week many, many times, and that an established order of events may well have occurred. Now, if that is true, if it is true there wasn't an established order of events, or if it is true the Gospel writers took enormous care, then how can it be that they mistake whether the Last Supper was a Passover meal or not? So to my mind, that's really difficult to understand. It doesn't in a way make sense. And so what I have tried to do is to say, is the problem with us rather than with the Gospels? In other words, are we failing to understand what the Gospels are saying? Because, for example, we lack knowledge of life in Jerusalem in the 1st century AD. So that's something which I've been exploring, and to a certain extent it's a new approach. It turns out you have to be multidisciplinary, so that the key thing is the New Testament text, but it turns out the Old Testament has a key clue, I believe, to explaining these apparent discrepancies. You have to look at Jewish writings and Roman writings at the time, so you really understand the scene and the context. It turns out it's important to understand something about ancient Egypt. And this is where the science comes in. It's important to, as Bob White indicated in his kind introduction, it's important to know something about astronomy and ancient calendars. And although the astronomy, the science, comes in probably at the 5% level, it's a critical 5%, I believe. So I actually think it's impossible to unravel these problems without this input of science. And I think that's probably why biblical scholars haven't come up with the solution I suggest. The solution I suggest, of course, may not be right, but at least there will be a solution. The problem we face today is that the arguments are really quite detailed. We need about 5 hours. We don't have 5 hours, so I will stop at the appointed time. But we'll see how far we can get. Chronology is the backbone of history, a well-known statement. If you go to the site of the Twin Towers, terrible events, then there's a very simple placard outside the 2 big holes in the ground, and the placard is just headed, or the big poster's headed, the chronology of 9/11. And it tells you hour by hour what happened, and the whole history is built around the chronology. And that is what you find in most modern history books. So that's what we want to try and do if we want to try and understand the last week of Jesus. The date of the crucifixion is the key date of Passion Week. It's a sort of marker date, and if you can get that right, then you can hope to get the other dates around it right as well. And our Christian faith, of course, we don't base our faith on some woolly set of philosophies. We base our faith on certain historical events, like the particular life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So if we can improve the historicity of these, we then improve the historical basis of our Christian faith. And not only that, I think if you place the crucifixion in its historical context, then you may get new insights into interpretation. I think we do. And in particular, some really striking new symbolisms emerge, which I believe would have been there and understood by the early Jewish community particularly, but symbolisms which we've largely lost. I first got involved in this because my father gave my daughter a book called Great Men of History. Today, I guess it would be called Great Persons of History. It was called Great Men of History, and in this book it listed about 20 people, and on the front page, as a sort of index, it told you the name of each person that would be discussed in the book, their date of birth and their date of death. So, for example, it had Julius Caesar, born 100 BC, died 44 BC. Alexander the Great, born 356 BC, died 323 BC. And then, against Jesus of Nazareth, it had born 4 BC, died AD 30, And you know that children are very good at asking perceptive questions, so my daughter said, "Daddy, why is it that of all these famous people, only Jesus we don't know when he was born and when he died?" Well, there's that question, it turns out, in a sense, is easily answered because Jesus was born a pauper. The Old Testament tells you that normally when Jewish people, babies were born, they were presented in the temple, the normal sacrifice, so as it was celebrate their birth, was a lamb and a pigeon. But if you were poor, Jewish law was very good here. If you were poor and couldn't afford a lamb, you could sacrifice 2 pigeons or 2 doves. And the Gospels tell us, in the case of Jesus, it was this latter 2 pigeons or 2 doves which were used. So Jesus was born a pauper. Joseph and Mary could not afford a lamb and a pigeon. And the dates of the births of paupers were just not recorded. And Jesus died a common criminal. Their dates were not recorded. Only the dates of important people were recorded. But that gives us a clue, that statement I've just made. If we can connect the death of Jesus with the lives of important people whose dates are known, then we start to get a handle on when Jesus may have died. So we're going to try and get the date of the crucifixion and just look at the first clues. And this, what we're going to try to do is get to start with a broad time span for the crucifixion. And here's a statement from Tacitus, the Roman historian, certainly a non-Christian. It's nice to have this piece of non-biblical evidence, as it were. Tacitus said, "There originated Christ had been executed in Tiberius' reign by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate." So Tacitus tells us that when Christ was executed, Tiberius was reigning, and the governor of Judea was Pontius Pilate. Matthew, and in fact other Gospels, tell us that when Jesus was arrested, Caiaphas was the high priest. Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas, all important people. Their dates of when they lived have been well established, and there's really little argument about this. So we know that Tiberius reigned from AD 14 to 37. Pilate was governor of Judea, AD 26 to 36. Pilate stopped before Passover time in AD 37. Caiaphas was high priest in AD 18 to 36. So if the crucifixion was in all these periods of time, we can then say the earliest possible date of the crucifixion was AD 26. It couldn't have been AD 25 because Pilate wasn't governing then, so that's the earliest date of crucifixion, and the latest date is AD 36. So the crucifixion must have been in that period, and just about all scholars agree with that. And just in passing, we know the evidence from the Gospels here agrees with the evidence from Tacitus. Joseph Blinzer's a German New Testament scholar who surveyed the published statements over 100 biblical scholars about the date of crucifixion, and these are the dates which have been suggested: AD 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 35. The only date in this period not suggested is 35. I'm not sure what's so special about 35. Every other date is suggested. The most popular date in his survey, these are the 3 most popular dates: AD 29, 13 scholars supported that. AD 30, that was the most popular with 53 scholars. AD 33, the next most popular, 24 scholars. Recently AD 21 has been suggested, but that really isn't very tenable because this 10-year period, AD 26 to 36, is so well established. But you see, within that range, there's huge uncertainty amongst biblical scholars. So that gives us a broad time span. What about the day of the crucifixion? All four Gospels and all early Christian literature is agreed that the day is a Friday. For example, this is Mark's Gospel. Mark says the crucifixion, about the crucifixion, it was preparation day, and then Mark says that is the day before the Sabbath. And the Jewish Sabbath ran from Friday evening to Saturday evening, so the day before the Sabbath was from Thursday evening to Friday evening. Jesus died in the afternoon, so Jesus died on a Friday. So that is well established. I appreciate some people may not believe in that, but you can ask a question afterwards if you wish. The time Jesus died is stated in the Gospels, Matthew's Gospel, at about the 9th hour. Jewish people reckon their day from sunset. They reckon their hours of daylight from sunrise. Sunrise at Passover time in Jerusalem was about 6 a.m., so the 9th hour is about 3 p.m. So we know that Jesus died about 3 p.m. on a Friday in that 10-year period, AD 26 to 36. Let's now return to the problem of the Last Supper. It's a well-known, very difficult problem. FREng, some of you will know, he said this is the thorniest problem in the New Testament. Right? You take all the New Testament problems, this is the most difficult. Dick France, writing recently his commentary on Mark's Gospel, the debate has been extremely complex and the issue remains unresolved. So let's just have a look at what the issue is. John's Gospel starts his description of the Last Supper with these words. It was just before the Passover feast, the evening meal was being served. This evening meal is the last evening meal John describes Jesus having with his disciples. And if you read the description, it's clearly the same as the Last Supper recorded in Matthew, Mark and Luke. And John pointedly says it was just before the Passover feast. And then later on, after the meal, when Jesus had been arrested, John says, the Jews led Jesus and Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor to avoid ceremonial uncleanness. The Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. And there's another statement of John which indicates that the crucifixion itself was before the Passover meal. So John clearly says the Last Supper was before the Jewish Passover, and the Passover lambs were slain on Nisan 14. Nisan was the first Jewish month of the year. It corresponds to our March, April. In the Jewish calendar in the 1st century AD and in the Jewish calendar today, the Passover meal is prepared on Nisan 14. That's when the Passover lambs were slain. And the meal itself is eaten that evening, which is at the start of Nisan 15. So the meal is eaten on Nisan 15. That's after sunset. The lambs are slain on Nisan 14 before sunset. And so John has Jesus dying on Nisan 14, with the Passover being the next Jewish day, Nisan 15. Matthew, Mark and Luke have a very different story. Here's Mark's Gospel. The disciples ask Jesus, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? And then Jesus says, as he's eating the meal, I've eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. So the disciples of Jesus call the meal, they're preparing a Passover meal. Jesus himself calls the meal a Passover meal. And so the Synoptic Gospels have the Last Supper as a Passover meal held at Passover time. That's in the evening start of Nisan 15. And then the crucifixion will be later that Jewish day on Nisan 15. Whereas John has Nisan 14. So let's just be sure about Passover time. Josephus spells out when the Passover lambs were slain in the 1st century AD. It was in the time period of 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. on this 14th day of the first Jewish month of Nisan. The Passover meal then started after sunset. There's a nice scene in the play version of Fiddler on the Roof that I saw, where this Jewish family go up onto the flat roof of their house, and they turn and they watch the sunset, and then they turn around 180 degrees and they watch the moon rise, and they go off and eat their Passover meal. The sunset and moonrise mark the start of the next Jewish day, Nisan 15, and then they start their Passover meal. And it's a long meal, many questions, and finishes about midnight. So that's Passover time in the 1st century AD and now. Biblical scholars have four possible solutions of this Last Supper problem. The first solution is that the Synoptic Gospels are correct and that John is wrong. In other words, the Last Supper was a real Passover meal and John is basically confused. If I can find it rapidly, let me tell you what C.K. Barrett, who is one of the supporters of this point of view, this is what C.K. Barrett writes. He says, John's interests were theological rather than chronological. He did not hesitate to repress, revise, rewrite, or rearrange. And in particular, what C.K. Barrett and other scholars who support that argue is that John earlier had described Jesus as the Lamb of God, and the Passover lambs were sacrificed on 14 Nisan, and the symbolism is wonderful if Jesus died on 14 Nisan. So, although Jesus really died on 15 Nisan, John distorted history and brought everything onto 14 Nisan. So that's one interpretation. Here's another interpretation, that synoptists are correct, the crucifixion was on Nisan 15, the Passover meal was that the Last Supper was a real Passover meal, but that we can interpret John to agree. And Don Carson's one of the people who support that interpretation. So, for example, when John says it was just before the Passover meal, Don Carson says, that just before refers to the foot washing. So the foot washing occurred just before the meal, and then the meal itself was a Passover meal. If you read John's account, that looks unlikely, because John's account says the evening meal was being served, and then there was the foot washing, then more of the meal was served. So, and then where John says that the Jews didn't enter the palace of Pilate because they wanted to eat the Passover, people like John Carson say eating the Passover refers to one of the later meals in Passover week, but not to the Passover meal itself. And again, that seems unlikely. So it's a sort of forced interpretation of John, which seems unlikely. But many scholars hold that view. Another view is that John is correct, his chronology is correct. It wasn't a real Passover meal, it was a quasi-Passover meal. So that Jesus, knowing about his imminent arrest and death, decided to have a Passover-like meal as his Last Supper. And people like Tom Wright, who are coming to speak here, hold to this point of view. And then the last, but the weakness of that argument is that if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the description is of a real Passover meal, it was seen, not a Passover-like. And then the last possibility is that both John's Gospels and the Synoptic Gospels are correct if John was using a different calendar from the Synoptics. So in one calendar, the meal was a Passover meal, and in the other calendar, it was before the Passover meal. That has not found wide favour, because no one has come up with decent alternative calendars, and perhaps less than 1% of scholars adopt that viewpoint. But scholars are broadly split between these three viewpoints. It's roughly a third each. So, and I should say that split is certainly not a Catholic-Protestant split, for example. So you get Catholic scholars that supporting all of these views. You get Protestant scholars supporting all of these views. You'll get evangelical scholars supporting all of these views. There's no one particular school on this. Okay, so now let's go back to the three clues that we have. The crucifixion was in the time period AD 26 to 36. It was on a Friday. It was either Nisan 14 or 15. Those three clues enable us to pose a well sort of posed scientific question, a logical question, and that is, in what years did Nisan 14 or 15 fall on a Friday in the period AD 26 to 36? If we had a Jewish calendar of the time, and we don't, then we could look up the calendar and find what particular years 14 or 15 Nisan did fall on a Friday in that period. We don't have a calendar, and that's why a lot of people just become stuck there, and you can't move on. I should say, it is relevant to modern celebrations of the Last Supper. If you look at the world's churches, then about half of them use unleavened bread for their celebrations of the Last Supper, believing it to have been a Passover meal in which unleavened bread was used. The other half used leavened bread, believing the Last Supper to have been before the Passover meal. So I now want to acknowledge Graham Waddington, who's an astrophysicist I work with in Oxford, to do some work on dating the crucifixion. Can we use, since we don't have calendrical records of the time, can we use science to reconstruct the calendar? In the 1st century AD, and in fact right up to the 4th century AD, the Jewish calendar was an observational calendar. Today it is a calculated calendar, but then it was an observational calendar. The first day of the month was defined as the evening when the new crescent moon was first visible. So the new light from the new moon gave rise to a new month, a rather nice piece of symbolism. The mean time between new moons is 29.53 days, so each lunar month is either 29 or 30 days long. There are no lunar months which are 31 days long, nor are there that are 28 days long. It is relatively easy to wind back the equations of motion of the moon around the Earth and the Earth around the Sun, and to find out 2,000 years ago when the moon, Earth and Sun are in line, it's called conjunction, and when, in a sense, that's the theoretical start of the month. The actual start of the month is later than that, because when the Earth and the moon and the Sun are in line, you cannot see the new moon. You have to wait about 30 hours, typically, until the new moon first becomes visible. So, in the past, people like Isaac Newton was one of the key people who tried to calculate this. They wind back the equations of motion, add on 30 hours, and say that's when the first day of the month was. This 30 hours is known to be inaccurate, and you really have to do the precise calculations and then calculate when the first faintly glowing lunar crescent would be seen against the sky background. And so Graham Waddington did this using the latest equations, even taking into account mountains on the moon to determine the moon's surface brightness. And the calculations were checked against hundreds of observations of new moons, both recent and in the past, and they agreed every time. So we have a lot of confidence in the accuracy of these calculations. So we can reconstruct the ancient Jewish calendar in the 1st century AD. There are two problems, though. One is intercalation. 12 lunar months are about 354 days long. A solar year is about 365 days long. So each year is a discrepancy of 11 days between the solar year and the lunar year. Jewish people wanted their calendar, their lunar calendar, to keep in step with the solar year for both agricultural and religious reasons. For example, on Nisan 14, the lambs had to be ready for sacrifice. Nisan 16, 2 days later, was a first fruits festival. In this case, the first fruits of barley, and what happened then was the priests would go out into the barley harvest, cut off the first sheaves, come back to the temple, wave them in the temple, and that inaugurated the barley harvest. Until that waving of the sheaves was done, the barley could not be harvested. So you can see why the Jewish calendar had to keep in step with the agricultural year, which of course is a natural solar year. So what Jewish people did, in the same way we add on leap days, they would add leap months, an extra month when required, and it was roughly 1 year in 3, because each year was about 11 days out. And the Sanhedrin determined this. That was the main Jewish court, chaired by the high priest, and they had a key rule, which was that Passover must fall after the spring equinox. And that key rule, you added an extra month to make sure that happened, and that automatically kept you in step with the solar year. But the priests could also take into account a severe winter, because with a very severe winter, the crops may not be ready, the lambs may not be ready, and so in addition to this rule, they could decree an extra month any year. So just think how wonderful that would be today if you had a deadline coming up and you could say, okay, an extra month. So they had this power. So on the other hand, I believe they use it very rarely, because if they got it wrong, then the crops would be ready too soon. And you might actually miss the barley harvest because you couldn't harvest it before Nisan 16. We have some records of when they did decree an extra month, and it seems to be rare. We have no records for that period, whether they decreed an extra month or not. So what we did in our calendrical reconstruction was we reconstructed it according to this equinox rule, And then every year we recalculate the calendar, taking into account the priest might have decreed an extra month. And that's the paper that was published in Nature that Bob White referred to. Our paper has been criticised because we didn't take into account the possibility of a cloudy sky. And that's a rarish event, but nevertheless it's a valid criticism, and we have now done that. So if there's a cloudy sky, so you can't see the moon, then the new month wouldn't start. It would start the next day. You couldn't delay it more than 2 days because Jewish people knew that the month was either 29 or 30 days long, and we actually have an ancient statement, a published statement, which says that if there's 2 cloudy skies, you just decree the next month has started, and the priest would do that. So, but we've redone the calculations saying that each month you might have been delayed 1 day. So that's now been taken into account, and these are the possible dates for the crucifixion. Nisan 14 fell on a Friday in these years, in the period AD 26 and 36. Nisan 15 fell on a Friday in those years. You will notice that 11 April AD 27, 11 April 27 occurs twice, and then it occurs twice because of this cloudy day, in fact. So if it wasn't there 1 year, it occurs the other day. AD 34 is there if there's an extra intercalated month, which the priest would have pronounced because of exceptionally severe weather. But those are the only possibilities. And I think the science, astronomical calculation is really tremendous. You can calculate future eclipses, as we've done very recently. You can land men on the moon. And I think we can have a lot of confidence in these, particularly now we included the possibility of a cloudy sky and so on. The earliest record we have of the date of crucifixion is from Tertullian, and he says it was on 25th of March, AD 29. He was writing in about AD 200. We can reject that date because 2 reasons. One is the Passover moon in AD 29 was in April and not March, so we got that wrong. And also, AD 29 is not a possible year for the crucifixion. But Tertullian, to his credit, goes on to say this date, he believed, was not accepted everywhere throughout the early church. So what we know is in AD 200, the date of the crucifixion was being debated, and there was no agreement. There wasn't a consensus about the answer. And of course it was very difficult. One tends to think that it was easier for people then to find out the true date than people now, but that's not necessarily the case. They certainly had no way of reconstructing the Jewish calendar in the period AD 26 or 36. So in fact, it probably is easier for us now to find the date than it was in AD 200. Well, I need to speed up. A few minor clues. John the Baptist Luke specifies in that chapter 3 verse 1 that John the Baptist started his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. Almost certainly Luke is counting years in the standard Roman way, and the 15th year is then 1st of January AD 29 to 30. We cannot be sure that Luke was not using a Jewish calendar. We do not know if he was using the religious calendar which started in the spring or the civil calendar which started in the autumn. So that is the earliest possible date if he was using the Jewish civil calendar which started in AD 28. Either way, if John the Baptist started his ministry in AD 28, which is the earliest possible date, John the Baptist then baptized Jesus. The crucifixion could not have been in AD 27. So we can go back to this table and we can cross out AD 27. It's too early for the crucifixion. Similarly, Paul's conversion, the earliest possible date for that is the latest possible date for that is AD 34. And most people believe there was something like an 18-month time period between the crucifixion and the conversion of Paul. But if he was converted in AD 34, then we can delete AD 34 as the year of the crucifixion. So going back, we can now, because it was too late, so we can now delete AD 27, AD 34, and you notice that interpretation of the Gospels we now completely delete. So science has enabled us to, in this reconstruction, say that only possibly 2 dates of the crucifixion, AD 30 and AD 33, both of them correspond to Nisan 14. So on these four possible interpretations that biblical scholars have, we can, I believe, delete the first one, we can delete the second one. Those are two possibilities. That John was correct, the Sopt is correct, that the Last Supper was a quasi-Passover meal brought forward, or if there was a two-calendar solution. So the crucifixion was on Nisan 14. It's interesting that Paul says, Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. This is a clear analogy with Jesus being sacrificed at 3 p.m. on Nisan 14. We know from Josephus the first Passover lambs were sacrificed at 3 p.m. on Nisan 14. So the symbolism is exact. And Paul surely would not have used that symbolism if it was one day out. If the crucifixion was on Nisan 14, then the resurrection was on Nisan 16, and that was the day when the first fruits of barley were weighed in the temple. Paul says, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. And his Jewish audience would have known precisely what was meant by the first fruits. It was this technical term for first fruit festival. And so what Paul is saying here is saying that this occurred on the same day, and just as waving the first fruits of barley in the temple enabled and inaugurated the barley harvest to begin, so Christ, being raised from the dead, enabled those who have fallen asleep, that is, those who have died, to be resurrected. It enabled and inaugurated this. So again, this exact symbolism from Paul. And if you put those two statements together of Paul, then clearly I think Paul would not have made them if both were one day out. So the statements of Paul fit very nicely the chronology we have. The apocryphal Gospel of Peter, if we look for other sources, there are just two other sources of the date of the crucifixion. Apocryphal Gospel of Peter specifically states that the death of Jesus was on the eve of Passover, that's Nisan 14, and the Babylonian Talmud says on the eve of Passover they hanged Yeshu, earlier called Jeshu the Nazarene, and Yeshu is the equivalent of our Greco-Semitic Jesus. So there's this unanimity that from all sources the date of the crucifixion was Nisan 14. We have those two possible dates. Can we distinguish between? Well, I think we can. The earliest date for the start of Jesus' ministry, as we said, was when John the Baptist started his ministry, that's AD 28. John's Gospels records 3 Passovers in the ministry of Jesus, including the one of the crucifixion. If that's the case, then the crucifixion could not have been in AD 30. There's also a temporal reference in John 2:20 where the Jews say to Jesus, it's taken 46 years to build this temple. And if you unpack that, then that again rules out AD 30 for the crucifixion. So AD 30 you can rule out, and leaving AD 38 for AD 33 as, I think, the most probable date and for the crucifixion. That date helps us to understand the behaviour of Pilate at the trials of Jesus, which some people have found curious. In the Gospels, Pilate is depicted as a somewhat weak individual. Here's a person who clearly thinks Jesus should not be crucified. He washes his hands of it. He vacillates. He comes across as a really weak person, which is curious because Josephus depicts him as very strong, and also Luke's Gospel earlier has said the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. So earlier on, Luke depicts him as a very strong character. However, Pilate was appointed by Sejanus, and Tiberius executed Sejanus in AD 31, and Sejanus was a well-known anti-Semite. He wanted to exterminate the Jews. Tiberius had him executed in AD 31, and following that, Tiberius sent a message round to all the governors saying, don't mistreat the Jews. And so, in AD 33, if that was the crucifixion date, that explains the weak behaviour of Pilate, because he'd lost his mentor, he'd lost the person who supported him, he was in a weak position himself, and he had this edict, don't mistreat the Jews. So what was he to do? Was he to crucify Jesus, or was he to listen to the Jewish high priest who wanted Jesus crucified? And so you can imagine this vacillating behaviour if the crucifixion was indeed after AD 31. So all the evidence fits that, and you notice this date is it's the second most popular date, which biblical scholars believe in, the second most popular year. I'm just now wondering what to leave out of, because let me just go on quite rapidly. Peter's Pentecost speech, just 7 weeks after crucifixion, has this interesting phrase that he quotes from Joel and says that recent events have fulfilled this prophecy of Joel, and he has this phrase, the moon was turned to blood, and let's try and skip things over, which may not be wise, but at least we can then try and cover the whole story. There are other references that at the crucifixion the moon appeared like blood. There are two other references which I give there. And what does this phrase mean? Well, it's a graphic description of a lunar eclipse. Some of you will have seen the eclipse last week. What happens is, geometrically at a lunar eclipse, the moon is in the Earth's shadow, and so the moon should appear black. In fact, light from the sun is refracted, it's bent around the Earth, and it strikes the moon, and that light has travelled a long path length through the Earth's atmosphere, and that light is red light. So the light from the sun, the blue is scattered much more than the red, so that's why the sky appears blue. And then when you watch the setting sun, all the blue light has been scattered away, and that's why the setting sun looks red, or the rising sun looks red. And the lunar eclipse is that red light which falls on the moon, is reflected back to Earth, and the moon looks red. And the eclipse last week, it's a rather coppery red. But here's a photograph of an eclipse taken from Liverpool in 1982. And you can get this really rather beautiful blood red colour. So this phrase could describe a lunar eclipse, and the phrase the moon was turned to blood, or looked the colour of blood, is described in ancient documents. It's a sort of standard description of a lunar eclipse. So I just mentioned one of these. Quintus Curtius, writing History of Alexander, 2 days after Alexander crossed the Tigris, the moon was suffused with a colour of blood. From details given, 2 days after Alexander crossed the Tigris, was the 20th of September 331 BC, we can retro-calculate, and we find on that date there was indeed a lunar eclipse. So we know that this moon suffused with a colour of blood was a genuine observation, and it was a lunar eclipse. And we do that with lots of other early records. And so it was a phrase used for a lunar eclipse. And so the question is, if this interpretation is right, were there lunar eclipses visible from Jerusalem in this 10-year time period? So Graham Waddington again has retro-calculated, and it turns out there was one eclipse that was visible in this 10-year period, and only one. So we have a unique solution, which is always nice in science, and the date of this eclipse was Friday 3rd of April 1833. And that agrees with the date determined independently, really independently using this other method. Let me skip. So we've answered some of the questions. We haven't answered all the questions. Let me just outline how you might answer the other questions. Because I got stuck there and thought, for a number of years. And if you go to the Old Testament, it's rather curious that the Old Testament gives two different dates for the Passover meal. In Exodus, book of Exodus, it's 14th day of the first month. In Leviticus, the 15th day. Numbers, the 15th day. Back in Ezekiel says, your Jewish people are in captivity in Babylon because you've disobeyed the commands of God and so on. And Ezekiel says, in the new temple, Passover will be on the 14th day of the first month. Old Testament scholars are aware of this, but they've got no explanation. In fact, the standard explanation is there's a number of sources from the Pentateuch, and some sources say 14 Nisan, other sources say 15 Nisan. That's not really an explanation because it doesn't say why some sources have different dates. And these different dates totally mirrors the discrepancy in the Gospels over the date of the Last Supper being 14 or 15 Nisan. And I'll just maybe deal with this problem and then finish. It's not a minor matter. The date of the Passover commemorates a particular date in history. So you don't easily change it. Think of changing your birthday. Your birthday is on a certain date, and then suddenly you change it. There has to be a good reason, a very good reason to do that. So why did this change occur in the Old Testament? And Well, Moses, if you think of the first Passover, Moses was living in Egypt. He would have been forced to use Egyptian calendars. He would have been known about these very well because he had been brought up in an Egyptian palace. There are two main Egyptian calendars in use at the time of Moses. A solar calendar, which is well known, and people know that about that well today. It has 365 days. But then there was a lunar calendar, which was used for religious purposes. A solar calendar was for business and everyday life, lunar for religious purposes. And the first day of the Egyptian lunar month was not the first visibility of the new lunar crescent. It was the first day of invisibility of the old lunar crescent. So it was a different day. And there they started at sunrise, because the old lunar crescent is last seen in the morning sky. So that's why the day starts at sunrise. And that's the calendar I suggest that Moses would have used for his first Passover, because it was the religious calendar of ancient Egypt. And then there must have been a change of Jewish calendars, because if the early calendar that Moses used had a day that started at sunrise, if the calendar that the Jews use today, and in the 1st century AD, started at sunset, then that calendar change necessitated a transfer of feast dates from the old calendar to the new calendar. And so I believe that's what happened. The Passover meal was transferred from 14 to 15 Nisan, and some Jewish people still kept to the traditional date, and others kept the new date. So we had a double dating of Passover. Exactly the same happened in Egyptian feasts, when they transferred Egyptian feasts from the lunar calendar to the solar calendar. Exactly the same has happened today with our dating at Easter. So today the Orthodox Church has Easter on a different date from Catholics and Protestants. Why? Because of the Gregorian calendar change. So before the Gregorian calendar reform, everyone had the same date for Easter. After the Gregorian calendar reform, the Orthodox Church says for our everyday life we'll use the Gregorian calendar, but for the dates of our festivals we'll use the Julian calendar, because that is our tradition. And so exactly the same thing has happened. I think it's only a calendar change which will give rise to changing such an important date. I think I should finish there. But you can go through, and you can see how the argument's developing, that in the 1st century AD there were two dates for Passover. In fact, we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that there were many calendars in existence, and I think that's the calendar which Jesus chose to use for his Passover supper, which was the original Passover calendar of Moses. Let's skip to the conclusions. The date of the Last Supper, this is a sort of twist in the tale, turns out to be a Wednesday, when you can calculate this Passover calendar of Moses. And it was a real Passover, just as synoptic calendars say, but in this original calendar of Moses. John's Gospel also correct, it was before Passover in the original calendar. This explains there's no missing Wednesday. Wednesday was when the Last Supper was held. We now have more time for the events between the Last and crucifixion, and the trials by the Sanhedrin were perfectly legal. And so that then becomes the key dates of the events in Easter week. So I'm sorry, it's been very rushed at the end. That gives you a flavour of a possible solution to these rather long-standing problems. Fine, thank you.
Well, thank you, Colin. That does leave us time for some questions, which people may have, and I see there are some already, so let's take them. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I must say you came across very much as a sort of modern-day Bishop Usher. I might be familiar. Bishop James Usher, famously in the 18th century, worked out the precise dates of the creation of the world. And I'm sure you all know it's Sunday, 23rd of October, 4004 BC, round about tea time. And to a non-believer such as myself, your talk really does come across as an exercise in trying to have one's cake and eat it. At one point, you actually said something which really encapsulates this. You said, knowledge strengthens the historical basis of the Christian faith. And one immediately says, well, which is it? Is it this historical evidence, or is it the faith? You said faith, you didn't say religion. And so the philosopher David Hume said this, that religion must depend on faith. And he would have described you as, in his words, a false friend of religion that tries to put religion to a test by which it is no means fitted to endure, in the words of Hume. So, just to finish off what I'm saying, I'd like to quote from Mark's Gospel, another line, which I don't know the exact verse, but I'm sure you'll recognise it. In Mark's Gospel, it says, "And lo, the disciples came towards Jesus, walking on the lake." And what that tells us is that the Gospel stories were made up. If Jesus existed, frankly, we don't know the first thing about him, and 3rd of April, 33 AD, I really think 1st of April would be better than.
Right, so let's not go into the cycle of walking on the water on the lake. But I personally believe that happened, right? And so I don't think, I personally think you can't just dismiss it like that. You're almost claiming Jesus didn't exist. I mean, there's references in Tacitus that I quoted. There's a reference in Josephus I didn't quote.
We don't know the first thing about it.
All right, we don't know the first thing about it.
It's almost academic with Jesus.
Well, we have a huge amount in the Gospels about it. And then the question is whether the Gospels make sense or not. And what I'm suggesting is that, there are these apparent discrepancies, and it's quite clear that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John didn't get together and say, let's sort out our disagreements, as it were, right? Because there are these apparent discrepancies. So it wasn't a sort of con job like that. And what I'm saying is, if you unpack these discrepancies, I think the agreement is remarkable.
Well, another thing you seem to be implying that the Gospels were written by contemporaries of Jesus. I mean, that's the major biblical scholarship, isn't it?
No, I'm not implying that. I actually said probably in the time span AD 50 to 90, something like that. If you look at the start of...
So haven't they known what we said?
Well, can I just
answer this, then we'll take another question.
I'll just answer this, then we will. But if you look at the start of Luke's Gospel, where if you read the start of Luke's Gospel, Luke starts his Gospel by saying he has consulted with eyewitnesses who were there from the first. And so Luke is actually saying, look, he says, I'm not an eyewitness, but I consulted with people who were eyewitnesses. And I think the early church, there would have been early written documents, early oral documents, and then they were finally put together. Most people believe Mark's Gospel was the first. Most people think it was about AD 50 or 60. I mean, it's actually very difficult to date. That sort of time period. John's Gospel probably the last, AD 80 or 90. That is mainstream thought, and I accept that. But they're based, I believe, on earlier documents, both oral and written tradition, and people like Luke consulted people who are eyewitnesses. So I believe the knowledge does go back very early, and that's why you get these tremendous details about what happened in the life of Jesus.
Thank you.
We can talk afterwards.
Yes. Are there any more questions?
When did the Friday is obviously our word for it, isn't it? I can't remember what the Greek actually says. Good Friday is mentioned, isn't it, in the New Testament?
Probably not as
not such as it. No.
The Jewish people, they called their days of the week the first day, the second day, the third day. Right. The Sabbath was different, and then there was preparation the day before the Sabbath. But all the others were numbered: first, second, third. So Friday's our day for it. It's the day in the Julian calendar, essentially.
Just point of clarification. You mentioned the two Egyptian calendars, the solar and the lunar, and the switch. And Moses would have used, did I get it right? The solar one or the lunar one?
Yeah, right.
How long did the process take the switch over? The calendars. Was it a very long ongoing process and people using simultaneously both, or was it sort of historical? Can you just clarify it?
It's a good question. I mean, we don't know is the answer. The Israelites, they started by numbering months. They had the first month, the second month. Then it seems they went on to Canaanite names, like Abib was called the first month. And then after the exile, they adopted Babylonian names. So the Babylonian name for the first month of the year is Nisanu, and the Hebrews called it Nisan. And I think when the Hebrews were in Babylon, in the exile, which was about AD 590, something like that, they would have been forced to use the Babylonian sort of calendar, which certainly had a sunset to sunset day. That was a lunar observational calendar. So I think the switch from their sunrise to sunrise day to a sunset to sunset day either occurred in the exile, or I suspect it occurred earlier than the exile, so probably before 600 AD. Sorry, it's before 600 BC.
Thank you, Colin. I said we'd finish at 2, so we will do that. Will you be around for a few minutes if people want to follow up things? Can I make just 2 announcements of forthcoming events? On this Saturday, 7 o'clock Saturday evening in Microhouse Cafe, that's in town, Trinity Street, there'll be a debate called Science and Religion, the Contemporary Debate. Colin will be on the panel. There'll be a panel of other people, including John Durant, who's flying across from MIT to be here, John Polkinghorne, myself and Dennis, and also Usama Hassan from the Muslim Council of Britain, debating the issue of science and religion. So do come to that, that's free. There are also posters for this and for all the courses the Faraday Institute is running, and in particular, it might not be too late to sneak into the next one, the weekend before Easter, particularly aimed at teachers, but actually for anybody with an interest in education. So do pick those up from over there before you leave, and pin them up wherever they might be useful to people if you can't come yourself. There is a bookstall at the back. There's CDs, DVDs of some previous talks, and also some books. So let's thank Colin once again, and we look forward to seeing you.